we have a fantastic conversation planned with a ton of polls, which is great. Sarah, who kind of at the last minute had something come up and couldn't be here, said in exchange she would write all the polls for us. So she did a great job making some really excellent polls. And we have 3 questions. And this week we made one really broad reflection question. And so we tried to have 3 questions and a bunch of polls to help kind of organize your thinking around that bigger question about the readings that really just says, how does constructivism work with literacy? So first poll, I want to do the first poll first to even just get a sense of those of you that are here, how much of the content, readings, etc. have you already completed? I think that the only person who hasn't voted is Gay, who just logged on, and there we go, 100% have voted. So we're half and half. And please, those of you who haven't done any, you don't need to apologize, because it's Tuesday and the weekend's on Friday, so we have plenty of time. But we have about half and half have done. Half of you have done most of it, and half of you have done none of it. So the good news is, this is a great week, though, to try and have this conversation without having done the readings and the videos, because it is one of the things that we spend so much time talking about. We talk about constructivism sometimes until we beat a dead horse. So there'll be a few things that I kind of, because I know that half of you haven't done the readings yet, that are things that I know that we made a point of explicitly mentioning, that I'll make sure to point out. Slide number 1, we want to talk a little bit about what kind of social tools we use in the domain of science. So in the readings and in the videos, we kind of make a big point about how constructivism relies on the use of social tools. And language is a social tool, and reading and writing are social tools. But so what are the social tools that we use in the domain of science? Not necessarily, I don't want to limit you to your classroom. You definitely can give examples from your classroom, but outside of the classroom, what are the social tools that we use? Any thoughts?
Chris, I feel like in science classes you're always doing group projects, and so you're collaborating with a group of peers to figure out how to work through the procedure and come up with the results. Is that what you mean by social tool?
That is definitely a social tool that we use in science, the idea of working together in groups. I love that we kind of have been able to, in the last 10, 20 years, push back on that image of the lone scientist. And kind of get more social acceptance to the idea that scientists work in teams, and that in schools we work in teams and we're able to reason together and scaffold each other. So yes, that definitely is one of the social tools that we use in science.
I think outside of the classroom, when I worked in the Forest Service, we were really dependent on interagency collaboration, and so this kind of conferencing, but peer-reviewed, peer check of the things that we did, which is kind of group work, but it takes it to a different level in terms of feedback and just cross-referencing the things that we were doing out in the field.
Yeah, that's another great one. The idea of the peer review and the idea of working and cross-referencing and checking, and I think that there's a lot in that kind of category of stuff that scientists use as social tools to work together. There are 2 questions that we have that kind of go along with this idea. So the first one, the first poll that goes with this, kind of ties back to the guiding principles of the constructivist learning environment. And this is the first time I think that we've done this. We're using a poll where you can choose more than one answer. And so there's a bunch of them listed here. And these all kind of tie into these social tools. And when we look at the big definition of social tools. So here's the poll that asks, which of the guiding principles of constructivist learning environments do you use most in your science classrooms? You can select one or more. So structure learning around primary concepts, pose problems of relevance, seek and value students' point of view, adapt curriculum to address prior conceptions, and assess student learning in context. So you can pick as many of those as you think you use in your classroom. Okay, I'm going to close and share these results so you can see them. So definitely this idea of posing problems of relevance, everybody is saying that we are doing that. And that does tie back to this idea of using a social tool and saying that we are going to have this be something that we can come together around because it's relevant to all of us. It's we're engaging socially, and we need to have some kind of sense of what's relevant for our students to do that. And everybody is adapting curriculum to address prior conceptions. Those are the two that are 100%. And then most people are saying structure learning around primary concepts and seek and value students' point of view. And then half of you assess student learning in context. And I think that one is a lot harder, assessing student learning in context. That's a whole shift, a whole assessment shift. So it really does tie into that same idea of these things. In order to do these things, we have to be using those social tools, or we're not going to be able to get at them. Anybody have any questions or comments about this?
I was just going to type in a comment about assessing student learning in context. I would bet that that number is actually closer to 100%. I think that we do that. That's just, even being aware of your classroom, during an assignment where you're going around assessing whether students are on task, whether they need more scaffolding. I think that kind of assessment is so informal, and it happens, at least in my classroom, so automatically. I wonder if that number shouldn't be 100%, because I bet people are doing it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the type of assessing learning in context that comes from formative assessment and really is about kind of assessing during the learning, I think the number would be a lot higher. The idea, though, of having authentic assessments, where instead of giving a multiple choice test that tests whether or not they understand this thing, that we're doing a hands-on lab as our final assessment for a unit, or in some other way we're trying to build the context into a more formal assessment outside of formative. I think that might be where that 50% response comes in, because that is then a whole different shift to move beyond the formative assessment to actually have your summative assessment be in context. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. I didn't know that you wanted it, that this was talking about formal, because you can't stop the progress in context constantly to assess formally.
Exactly. So I think, it doesn't have to be formal. I'm saying that 50% probably has more to do with whether it was about the assessment as a formative assessment that is happening in context, or the idea of actually shifting to a larger scale. Even our formal assessment is happening in context. I think that probably is where the 100% didn't show up, because people were thinking of a bigger type of assessment. But I agree with you that formative should definitely be in context. Okay, so I want to go actually straight from this poll into the poll that when I tried to pull this up, I noticed that I had missed one. So you guys talked a little bit about group work in the classroom as one of the social tools that you use. And so this is a question that that Sarah put in that I really liked as a bridge between the idea of social tools and the idea of scaffolding. So this question of how do you facilitate group work in your classroom? How do you make sure that that group work goes well, that it can function as a social tool in a meaningful way? So do you assign students roles? Do you model productive collaboration? Do you discuss expectations? Do you use formative assessments while the group works, or do you use something else? And we did leave in here this primarily. So you have to pick the one that is the thing you rely on most. Not that you aren't doing some of the others, but what's your primary way of making sure group work functions as a social tool? This is very interesting. You'll love to see this. So every one of you picked the same one. that your primary way of doing this is discussing expectations for collaborative work, which I think is fantastic. That's the one that I would have picked as well, that would be my primary way. The others are things I maybe used, but these would be, that one would be the same one for me. So just if you guys could comment on, I know a lot of times I see popping up either in here or in the discussion forum people saying, can you show me how you do that? How long do you take to do that? Do you kind of have a set routine for doing that? So I'm curious, do those of you that are here today, when you discuss those expectations for collaborative work, do you have a set format for that discussion that you use every time? Or are you still kind of trying to find the sweet spot of how to have that discussion productively?
Well, for me, in my classroom, in terms of collaborative work, I always try to design some sort of rubric so that it gives students the opportunity to see what their individual responsibility is, what the individual product that they'll be responsible for at the end of the unit, activity, project, whatever, plus how they will have to coordinate that with the other people in their group. So they get to see that rubric, so they have a little checklist. I'm doing this on my individual side, and then, where's my group? Are they doing their individual work? So we discussed that, and we refer to it throughout the whole project.
So that's a pretty formal way of discussing expectations for collaborative group work, by giving them a rubric that makes really clear what those expectations are, and they can be metacognitive about it, they can do some self-regulation. That's great. Is that a rubric something you'd be willing to share?
Oh, you bet. It'll take me a day or so to find it and pull it up, but I need to start getting my beginning of the year process going anyways, and it's something that I have kids put in the very front of their lab notebook so that they have that at the beginning of the year and can refer to it at any time.
Excellent. What about the other people on the call today? What are some things that you do in terms of how you discuss those expectations? How do you make those clear to students?
This is Heather, and for those, I guess, that don't know me, my teaching has primarily been in a non-formal nature center setting. So I'm taking kids on field trips and taking them out in the field. So most of the group work is actually, physically they need to go collect insects and share the net and share the container, and then together use the books. So for each project we do, I'm able to give them, 3 or 4 sort of guidelines for how to work well with their partner. And it's not as formal as a rubric, because it's usually for a much shorter period of time, but I'll give them the guidelines, and then we head into the field, and then I can just sort of visually check in with each group, and you can tell pretty quickly if someone's not being involved and their partner's hogging the insect net, or the books are not really working collaboratively. So I can sort of assess as we go along and give them feedback and help them learn to work together as a group.
Excellent. So again, I think it's important to point out the different contexts, because a rubric wouldn't make sense in your context, but it sounds like it's really a similar thing. You have guidelines, they're clear, they know what the guidelines are, and you're able to check in on them. Excellent. Okay.
Sorry, this is Sandy. And yes. I do assign student roles at the very beginning for certain, just even gathering tools and anything like that. And then I do a lot of modeling before, and then we discuss their expectations. So it's almost a combination. And then while we're doing a lab or a project, I will stop them and we'll talk about who's working well together. What do you think? Do we need to change anything to help us complete the expectations that I have for them?
Yeah, actually, Sandy, I'm really glad you said that because I have a theory, a suspicion, that what you just described is something that's much more common in the early grades, as in probably before 6th or 7th grade. This idea that we really do the formal process of assigning roles and modeling it at the beginning and then having those expectations throughout. Whereas when I got to the point of getting them as juniors in high school, I kind of said, look, you've been through this for years now. Here's my expectations. You have any questions, right? And I didn't go through, I never assigned student roles, ever at all. But I also got juniors in high school. And I think that that ties in really nicely to the idea of scaffolding, that in order for collaboration to happen productively, there are some things that we need to be doing as we scaffold them to be ready. And that it should maybe look a little bit different across the grades. There's some things you should need to do in 4th grade that I shouldn't need to do anymore with juniors. And that the bigger issue becomes coordinating across the teachers that those students are having to make sure that we really are kind of as a group scaffolding them up to the point of being able to do group work and collaborate.
Absolutely. Those little kids need a lot of scaffolding, otherwise it could be quite dangerous and nothing would get accomplished.
Right, and you can't just hand a 4th grader a rubric and say, here's a rubric. My expectations are clear now, right? But I can, with juniors in high schools, hand them a rubric and say, if you don't understand something, it's your job to ask me, you know. So, yeah. And the other thing that I just want to say, and some of you have heard me say this so many times that I'm sure you're sick of it, but, you know, GE funds a lot of stuff right now in education. They're pouring, I'm sure I know it's millions, but I'm sure that like at some point they may be pouring $1 billion a year into education right now. And they're major supporters of anything happening where multiple states are getting together trying to make things better. And they're huge supporters of science because they have to hire scientists and engineers. And they were talking about that hiring process. And they told us that, you know, for one position, they get thousands of applicants. And of the American applicants, about 2% are qualified for one engineering position. 2% are qualified. That's really sad. And when we pushed back and said, well, but why aren't they qualified? They said it's not the content. We're all teaching the content just fine. But these people coming out of American schools and American engineering programs have no idea how to work in a group, and they have no idea how to collaborate. We're not teaching them that. And so I think that this is really important. It's one of those soft skills that we have to do a better job at because these social tools are used in the domain of science. You know, we cannot do science and engineering without the social tools that we're talking about.
Hey, Chris, do you have a source for that? I would love to be able to use that on multiple levels for my students and for administrators who sometimes question collaborative work. And, you know, collaboration and group work is just it's a really significant foundation for my own teaching philosophy. So I'd love to be able to cite that source and where that 2% comes from.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me. I'm going to email. It was a year ago when I heard the presentation, and since that time I've had a few separate times thought to myself I should see if either they recorded it and I could access the recording, or if I can send an email to the person who said it and just say, you know, I've been citing you all the time, can you give me a formal citation? Because it was the director of institutional giving for GE that she was being asked that all the time, so she went down to their hiring department and asked for the numbers, and she was quoting their numbers. So I'll do my best to track her down.
It just would be interesting because, as I put in my post, sometimes I allow groups to fire a member of their group, but they all have to be present and come to a conference outside of class. And I think that that would be an ideal opportunity to, reiterate that kind of statistic to let them know that this isn't just about getting along in school in a group for science class, but it's way bigger than that.
Yes, yes. I made a note. I will, as soon as we get done with the calls today, I'll go online and try and track that down. I know that I can track down the name and contact information of the person who was speaking, but it's possible it was recorded, so I'll go in and look. So, but I was actually about to read your post, Stacy, that you had put in, but about how sometimes in high school or another thing you do in high school is a peer rubric so they can assess each other, and they're allowed to fire a group member, which I think is fantastic, because sometimes you do have that situation where you really need to have a formal way to say you're not pulling your weight, and if there is that kind of formal setup for it, then you're not it stops being as personal, I know even with my undergrads, I had them assess each other on their group work to help me with grading, so that it was less about whether or not I liked a student and more about whether their group could really articulate that they had been a positive part of the group. So, okay, if you guys want to come back and talk more about group work, we definitely can later, but we're going to move on to the next question on the slide and ask what kinds of instructional scaffolds we can use to facilitate the Common Core standards in our science classrooms. And so specifically, and we've actually, in asking this question, we're coming back and we're, probably maybe beating a dead horse, because we've talked a lot about these instructional scaffolds throughout the other 4 weeks of the class, or the other 5 weeks of the class. But now we're trying to call attention back to them to make the point that in a constructivist learning environment, we need to have reading and writing. And so what are the scaffolds that we use? What are the things that we use to help students to be successful with those Common Core literacy skills in science? So if you feel like you might be stating the obvious, that means you're right.
This is Sandy. Of course, we need that modeling in order to do, whether it be the reading or the writing. Especially, I look at the younger kids when they're reading or writing different types of writing or different types of reading than they're used to. We have to use a lot of modeling.
Excellent. So one of the instructional scaffolds that we use is to model, or to show them how to do it before we ask them to do it, which is also a great example of a social tool, right? Like the presence of the experienced person showing you how it's done is a social tool, and that functions as modeling that then scaffolds their learning of the proper thing. And I wasn't able to attend last week's meeting because we were crazy busy in a workshop and I kept losing internet. But that's one of my favorite things about the idea of modeling, is this idea of latent learning. Every time they see us do it correctly, they're learning something. But then there also is that in the cognitive modeling where we're being so explicit about what we're doing and why we're doing it, that it's not even just latent learning. They're actively learning the process through our modeling.
This is Gay. A couple of the things, highlighting critical processes in whatever the kids might be doing, or providing hints, or asking them questions that would be kind of like guided inquiry that would help them, I suppose, get to the point, or help them get to where I'd like them to go a little bit more quickly. Also maybe asking them questions to maybe help them to reflect so that they start learning to be metacognitive.
Yeah, so you said a few things there. One was asking questions, which is great, and that is definitely, a lot of times we associate that directly with an inquiry learning environment, and definitely in an inquiry learning environment we need to stop giving answers and start asking questions and responding to a question with a question and all of that. But in any constructivist learning environment, asking those questions is what allows the student to take the steps that they need to construct their own knowledge. And I think 2 weeks ago, when we were talking about in information processing, and we talked a little bit in this forum about how it's hard when we need to find that balance between giving them our organization versus letting them develop their own organization. And I think that this kind of goes back, what you were saying there, Gay, goes back to that we need to ask them questions so that they can actually construct their own knowledge and figure out what they know and what they don't know, and take the next step that's right for them, not that's right for us. So let's see here, what other kind of instructional scaffolds? One of them we already talked about today, but we've talked about it in the past. We have a whole place in the forum where you can post this kind of scaffold as exemplars for your peers if they want to use it. And that would be the scaffold of the rubric, which is a great scaffold, especially for literacy things in science, that we're able to give those really explicit, not directions, but understandings of what's expected. That really is a great way to launch a scaffold, or to scaffold understanding, because we can isolate the pieces of the rubric that they really are struggling with, and support them just on the piece that they need. That's one of the big things about scaffolding, is that it has to fade. You know, it has to be that we set this scaffold up, and as soon as they're ready to do a part on their own, we fade back and let them do it on their own. So rubrics are a great place for that, because we can pick just the pieces that they're struggling with to scaffold. Any other instructional scaffolds you want to make sure to mention?
I have a really small one to throw in. Whenever I'm introducing a new topic, I will, you know, for instance, if it was macroinvertebrates, I will put the word up on the board and ask them, you know, what comes to mind for them, and have them sort of start giving me some concepts, and we put that up as a concept map on the board, and then I can start to add to it, building on what they already know. I start to add some more detailed information so that they're kind of jogging their memories, and then we're taking it the next step.
What you're saying is that we have a new term, we have this either vocabulary or other piece that we need that really ties into MCCS, and actually we're going to do a group graphic organizer before we get started, which scaffolds their use of graphic organizers, their understanding of the term, and their process of how to take in new information and organize it in meaningful ways. That's an excellent one. Thank you. That was not small. I think I heard somebody else chiming in, but...
Yes, that was me. This is Gay. What I was thinking too, sometimes as you move around the classroom to the different collaborative learning groups, visit with the kids, asking different ones to, you know, summarize what they found so far, or to clarify something. And I think in doing that, then they also run it through their brains, and it also helps them learn and remember.
Yes. And I have to say I am terrible about that one, because instead of letting them clarify for each other, I tend to hear what a group says and repeat it out to everyone instead of allowing them to take ownership of their ideas. But that's another great one, that as you hear that, to allow them to support each other. It's fantastic. Okay, so let's go. The next, we're going to this is our last slide that's up on the screen. We have 2 polls to go with it, but it's kind of goes back to this idea of how can teaching through inquiry help facilitate learning of both content and literacy skills. And so knowing that 2 of you haven't looked at the literacy or the inquiry stuff for this week, and the other 2 of you who've done most, you may have left the inquiry for last. I want to say a couple of things about inquiry before we kind of dive into it. One thing about inquiry is lately in science we've talked a lot about the science and engineering practices, which are part of the framework, which we'll talk about next week. Or sorry, we'll talk about the week after next. But sometimes, and I'm guilty of this too, sometimes we say, well, we've talked about scientific inquiry for a long time, and now we're going to use some new terms for that stuff, and we're going to talk about the science and engineering practices. And if we're just saying scientific inquiry, if that's we're limiting inquiry down to just that kind of one cycle of scientific inquiry, that could be an accurate statement. But inquiry itself is much bigger than just scientific inquiry. Inquiry is a method, a constructivist kind of entire theory of learning where students are asking their own questions and building their own knowledge. That's much bigger than just the limited piece that we would call scientific inquiry. And so I think that in science we're going to have a little bit of a struggle over the next few years as we transition to the language of the science and engineering practices and the language of the framework. We're going to have this temptation to kind of toss inquiry to the side and talk about these new terms. And it's important that we not do that too much, because inquiry is still a very, very valid constructivist framework. We need to transition those scientific terms to the language of the practices, but keep inquiry as a larger model, because we can't really do without inquiry as that larger model. And while saying that, I will say that within the research, people have strayed away from using the term inquiry, and there's a few other terms out there right now that they're using instead of inquiry, like teacher responsiveness or responsive instruction, other things like that. And I don't think that the field has settled on whether or not they're going to move to a different term for inquiry, or if they do move to a different term, what that will be. So we're going to stick with inquiry for now. I feel like it's really important because from so many sources, we're kind of getting this information about how the practices are what's important, and the practices fit within inquiry. They don't replace inquiry. So that's one really important thing. And then this question specifically, for those of you who haven't watched the PowerPoint, there's a chart in it, and actually I probably can pull the chart over so that you guys can see it. Did that work? Yes. Okay, so what you can see here is this inquiry framework that shows levels of student ownership. And I explained this in the video, but this question is really getting at the idea that in a closed-ended demonstration or in guided inquiry, we're really only teaching existing knowledge to the students. We're guiding them to it, and we're doing inquiry. It's not that it can't be inquiry if it's guided. It's just that the goal of the activity is only to get at the knowledge. If we do bounded or open-ended inquiry, which are ones where in bounded inquiry, you kind of still have some limits to where the students can go, but they really are making their own decisions. You're not guiding them terribly much. They just maybe have been given an initial question or a range in which they're looking. Whereas an open-ended inquiry, maybe they have a question, maybe they made it up themselves, and they really are, it's kind of limitless how they go through their steps. That these also, in addition to teaching the knowledge, they teach the process of knowledge construction itself. Okay, they teach students how they learn. And then there's this one down here where sometimes we actually collaborate with researchers. In that case, we aren't able to be very open-ended because the researcher needs to guide things, but this is the one case where we're actually creating knowledge new to the discipline. Sometimes here in open-ended inquiry, students can stumble upon knowledge new to the discipline, but they probably are trying to get at existing knowledge and the process of knowledge construction. Okay, so just because I know most of you haven't seen that yet, that makes this question hopefully make a little bit more sense. That how can teaching inquiry help to facilitate learning of both content and literacy skills is kind of that parallel of that we're not even then just teaching knowledge construction or how to learn, but we're actually then, by using inquiry, teaching students literacy skills as well, which isn't on that chart but ties in. So what do you think? How does the process of using inquiry facilitate both parts, or even all three parts if you want to go there? Or did none of that make sense, in which case you're welcome to ask me a question.
Now this is Stacy, and I really rely on inquiry as that engager motivator, that inspires students, or hopefully that's my goal, inspires students to want to access the content in more traditional literary, text format or however, but the actual process of inquiry, if they're going through it and they're interested and they find it relevant, they have to go find the appropriate vocabulary, the appropriate models and whatnot to facilitate the process that they're going through in the classroom. So inquiry is what I see as the motivator for, students wanting to build their literacy skills.
Excellent. I think my experience is exactly that is true. That the more that, for me to say as a science teacher, you really need to learn how to read an article written by a scientist. I might experience some groans from the audience, right? Like, that's not very much fun. But if I get them excited about something and I say, well, the place that you're going to need to go to get the information you need is a scientific article, then they're learning how to read a scientific article because they care. And that's a whole different process of learning. And we could go back to that first poll. We can go back to those early slides. That's one of the principles of a constructivist environment, that it needs to have emerging relevance. And what you just said is that we motivate students so that it naturally has that emerging relevance. The literacy part too, not just the content. Any other thoughts about how using inquiry helps facilitate learning both content and literacy skills?
This is Gay again. Inquiry itself, where the students or the teacher, I guess, would construct a scientific question that would engage the students. And then, again, with your using background research, where the students are going to have to go and read some scientific data or scientific I don't know what I want to say, like Science or Nature, some of those journals is the word I wanted to use there, where they have to collect some evidence, ahead of time, or collect some background information, and then read about it, write about it, speak with their collaborating student partners about it. In doing hands-on or doing experiments, they're going to have to collect the information and then determine what the information means, evaluate it, analyze it, talk to their peers about it, write about it, make sure that that in their writing that it's, again, is evidence-based, goes back to that. I think they have to evaluate their explanations, and that they have to, if someone disagrees, that they have to develop an argument in favor and using their evidence of their explanation. So I think everything with inquiry has to do with all the literacy skills and developing those literacy skills.
I agree, and I'm just going to say, when you do your final project, you can pick whatever you want to use to do your final project, and I think I could make a strong argument that using any of the theories is easy. I mean, any of these theories relies on literacy in some way, and any of these theories is best instruction for science. And so taking an existing unit or set of lessons and kind of building that into it, or developing a new set and building that into it, shouldn't be a massive stretch. However, I will say that if you use inquiry, it's kind of somebody did it for you, right? Because we can hit nearly every one of the Common Core standards in a full inquiry cycle, right? Like, it's all in there. It's just a matter of it being the full inquiry cycle needing to be included. So, and I think that if we, as the science community, if we'd all feel like, well, this is new that we're teaching literacy skills, then maybe we weren't doing a full inquiry cycle the way that we thought we were. Because you just articulated beautifully, Gay, how they're all in there.
Thank you.
This is Sandy. One of the things that I noticed in my classroom is when we are doing literacy, the students, so if we're reading a story and focusing on the literacy. Half of our stories have a science content to them, and then the kids actually are asking questions and curious, so you can also go through it that way and going through different inquiry, but based on the literacy that they began with.
Yes, definitely. And I think especially with young children, I get made fun of a lot because I have an entire box at my house of like books I've bought used that are about all kinds of things. And people are like, well, why do you have these? Don't you have libraries? And I say, yes, I have libraries. But when my kid asks about a hurricane and is actually willing to read it right then, I don't have the library in my house right then. So I keep all these books because with young children, you never know which direction it's going to go. Maybe you're sitting reading a fictional piece and it references something and they ask if that's real, and all of a sudden now I have an engaged learner. And I hope that I can come up with the resources right away to keep them engaged until we've answered their science question. So I want to ask this next poll question, and it's another one that asks you to pick just one, and I know that you all do many of these because we've learned to make sure that these things go together, but it asks in terms of the amount of time that you spend in your classroom, which of the parts of the inquiry do you think you spend the most time on with your students? Do you spend more time on asking, developing the questions, figuring out what the problem's going to be? You spend more time on investigating them, reading about them, doing the experiments, creating that explanation, kind of writing it up, having a formal lab write-up or a formal definition of the answer, discussing it as a class, responding to each other, having those peer discussions, or reflecting on what you've learned. And getting ready to see kind of where you've ended up and where you'll go next. Okay, so 100% voted and share. So 3 of the 4, it said investigate is the thing that they spend the most time on, is actually doing the investigations. And one person said create. I think that I would have to say that investigate was the thing that I spent the most time on, but I wish that I could say that create and discuss were the ones that I spent the most time on. I think that myself as a teacher, that was probably one of my places that I fell down, that I would ask them to investigate, write it up individually, turn it in, and then wait for me to grade it, instead of kind of spending more time on creating our explanations, creating our understandings, and then discussing them as a group. Does anybody else have any reflection on kind of how this question of which thing you spend the most time on, how does that make you reflect on your process of using inquiry?
This is Gay again, and I put create because in setting up inquiry activities, you have to think, you have to really know the material, you have to think of different ways or different pieces of equipment or whatever you want to use that could help the students do inquiry activities to finally arrive at the concept that you were hoping that they would arrive at. I think you have to and have multiple sets of materials out there to do that. So that's where the creating took a lot of time for me, to really think it all through.
Yeah, exactly. Great. I think that's what again, that's kind of what I was saying, that I wish that I had done a better job on that end of things and not just spent so much time focusing on doing the investigation and kind of built up some of the other parts like creating. I like this the comment that just came through. If you want to speak to it personally, you're welcome to, but that somebody said, given my focus on promoting metacognition, I wish I could respond, reflect. And yes, me too. I wish that I could say that I spent more time asking my students to reflect on whether where they ended up matched where they started, or what they might do to fix that, or how their process went. And I sadly didn't spend nearly enough time as a teacher doing that. And I think that's incredibly valuable.
I think so. Because I want my final project and everything to reflect metacognition through information processing, I see this as just really the biggest gap in my teaching presentation. And so when I see this, I'm, all throughout this whole process, I just keep seeing where this is so powerful for students to be able to gain content through literacy and through the whole scientific process through metacognition. And wow, I don't allow for it in my class at all. So it's great to be able to have this focus to work on it during the summer, so I'm prepared this fall.
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk later this afternoon a little bit too, so about metacognition and final projects and all of that. But I think that metacognition can be a buzzword sometimes, that people kind of throw out there, this idea of metacognition, and it's kind of, it's kind of a really big deal. It's really powerful. And taking some time to really make sure we're getting metacognition right is worth it. Okay, so I think that we do have, I'm going to hide the poll results. We have one more poll question that we can ask, but I think that we've already addressed it. And so with just a few minutes left, I just want to know, does anybody have other questions or things they'd like to bring up about constructivism or about scaffolding, the zone of proximal development, inquiry, any of that, things that you would like to know more about or like to say before doing your reflection for the week? Okay. Well, if you have any questions, email me. Everybody should be back into the course now. Curtis reset everybody who got kicked out, and if you haven't gotten kicked out of the course yet and you get kicked out, let us know right away, and we'll put you back in. And then also another thing that I think I addressed this in the email about the grade book, that it's really messed up, and I've been avoiding putting scores in, which are mostly 10s, because it'll send people failure notices. So later today, when I get around to that, you may get a failure notice. You're not failing. And finally, I just wanted to say that this week is kind of a heavy week, and because this is something that a lot of people already know a lot about, and so that's why we had a lot of optional readings for those that might feel weak in one or more areas. But it is important to just kind of take some time to step back and think, because a lot of the terms that are used in this week of content are things we misuse all the time, because we've kind of appropriated them and used them differently in context than they were originally intended. And so we've tried to pull back and give an opportunity to be really clear about scaffolding and zone of proximal development and inquiry and kind of what they really are, or originally were, to clear up any confusion that's out there. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a fantastic week, and we'll be back same time, same place, same station next week on Tuesday.